Hello. Welcome to everyone who's watching and listening online, to everyone gathered here in this space today. It is good to be back with you after several weeks off. I always say when I come back from my summer break, I love to preach, but I also love getting a break from preaching. And I know you love getting a break from hearing me preach, so it's a win-win for everybody. And I appreciate so much the good work that was done in my absence with Eddie Sharp and Farland Clark and Luke Norsworthy, all doing a fantastic job continuing to lead us through the story of David's life. And a lot has happened in David's life while I was away. He killed a giant. He became a hero. He became best friends with Jonathan, the king's son. He married Michal, the king's daughter, and he became the enemy of Mad King Saul, who wants him dead. If you would turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 21. And at the end of chapter 20, David is on the run. He has to leave behind his wife, and his best friend, and his job, his comfortable home. He goes on the run from Saul. And he will spend the next several years of his life as a fugitive. And in chapter 21 of 1 Samuel, the first place David goes on the run is to the sanctuary in Nob, where he surprises the priest who can't figure out why David is alone. Already, David is important enough that he travels everywhere with an entourage. And the priest can't figure out, why are you alone? Why isn't anyone with you? He senses something is wrong. And David puts him at ease by saying, don't worry, I'm on an important secret mission for the king. And he tells the priest that he needs the priest's help in order to complete his mission. In other words, David lies to a priest to ensure that the priest gives him what he needs to escape from Saul. And in doing so, David puts the priest, and not just the priest, but the entire village of Nob in danger. And I suppose this is as good a place to pull over for a moment as any and remind you, although I know you don't need reminding, but to remind you that even though David is famously known as a man after God's own heart, much of what we see him doing in 1 and 2 Samuel is not worthy of imitation. Nor can we justify his actions because of his circumstances. David does some terrible things. Long before Bathsheba, David does some terrible things, especially when he's on the run from Saul. Remember, these stories are told not to glorify David, but to glorify God. And one of the ways these stories glorify God is by showing us how God uses this sincere but grossly imperfect shepherd-turned-warrior, soon-to-be warlord, to accomplish his purposes and move the redemption story forward. And in this way, I tend to think the David story is more encouraging to us, or at least encouraging in a different way, than the Jesus story is. The Jesus story shows us who God is and what God is like and what God looks like when God becomes flesh and walks among us in an imperfect world. But God and Jesus, that Jesus reveals, is perfect in an imperfect world. And the Jesus story inspires and calls us to become more like Jesus. It gives us something to aim for. And we strive to imitate Jesus. But oh, don't we identify with David, who constantly exposes the tension and the contradictions inherent when imperfect people in an imperfect world try to be faithful to God and come up short. Try to always do the right thing, but can't quite get there. I mean, think about it. You're on the run like David is. You're hungry, you do not have a weapon, you're in a hurry, you're desperate. David doesn't have time to get into this long rigmarole with the priest and tell him about his rift with King Saul. Risk being turned away, because why would the priest want to help the king's enemy? And so David takes the quickest, easiest route possible. He lies. Just like many of us. Just like some of us. Just like a few of us. Okay, just like I would in that situation. And this doesn't justify it, nor does it mean it's without consequence. Because David's lie allows him to leave Nob with food and a weapon. Goliath's sword, to be precise, it's being stored there. But while David is there, one of Saul's spies sees the priest helping David. Remember, the priest is only helping David because he thinks he's helping the king, because he still thinks David is serving Saul. And the spy goes back and reports to Saul, hey, I saw the priest helping David. And the spy named Doeg, not Doug, not dog, something in between, Doeg, belongs in a Braveheart scene, Doeg. Doeg tells Saul what he's seen, and Saul tells Doeg, kill the priest. No, kill all of them. Kill all 85 priests living in Nob. And while you're at it, wipe out the entire village, and that's what Doeg does. He kills all the priests, all the men, all the women, all the children, all the livestock in the village. Because David deceived the priest into helping him. Later on, when David learns of what has happened, when a lone priest escapes the slaughter and reports to David, this is what David says in chapter 22, verse 22. Oh, hey, that's me. Never mind. I'm a little rusty. 22, verse 22. David says to the priest who reports the news, he says, that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul, I am responsible for the death of your whole family. Notice, David does not lament the deception. He takes responsibility for the death, but he doesn't say, oh, I wish I hadn't have lied. Instead, I think what he's saying is, I wish I hadn't left Doeg alive. I knew when I saw him there, I had to eliminate him. But maybe he was in too big of a hurry. Maybe he wasn't worried about the consequences. Now, from there, David goes to Gath, in the next scene in chapter 21. Gath is Philistine territory. It's the home of Goliath, whose sword, I assume, David hides before he marches into town. And I guess David thinks he will go unrecognized in Gath. But he's got this huge social media profile. There's no way David can go anywhere without someone knowing who he is. And he walks into town and people know immediately, that's David. He's the one they sing about. Saul kills his thousands, David kills his tens of thousands. He's the one who's killing all of our people. And David immediately knows he's made a mistake. I don't know what he thought he was accomplishing, trying to hide in Gath. But he's afraid, and so he feigns insanity. He scratches at the gate like a wild animal. He drools and slobbers and allows the spittle to run down his beard. You see David there, playing the madman. This is the Lord's anointed. This is the pride of Israel, celebrated in song. Our friend Lynn Anderson has written in one of his books talking about this scene. He says, first David sacrificed his integrity in Nob, and then he sacrificed his dignity in Gath. David is not at his best when he is on the run from Saul. But for some comedic relief, I do love what Achish, the king of Gath, says when he sees David. Achish said to his servants, look at the man. He's insane. Why bring him? I'm sure they haul him in front of Gath. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? The king is like, hey, we're all stocked up on crazy here in Gath. I don't need anybody else. Get rid of him. So David's cagey ploy allows him to escape. He goes to Adullam, where he hides out in a cave. That damp, dark, lonely cave was a long way from his father's pasture. It was a long way from the king's court back when things between David and Saul were okay. It's a long way from his home with Michal. How does a national hero and heartthrob end up a fugitive hiding out in a cave all by himself? I'm sure David is just as surprised by this turn of events as anyone. I doubt that when Samuel anointed him to be the next king of Israel, David thought, yeah, but first I got to do some time in a cave. We never expect to do time in the cave, do we? The cave is where you end up when life takes an unexpected turn and you come to a dead end in your life. The cave is where you end up when the life you thought you were going to be living, the dream you thought you were going to be celebrating and actualizing, when it disappears before your eyes and you are left there in the dark, all alone. The cave. And there are a number of forces and factors that chase us into the cave. A mad king throwing a murderous spear can chase us into the cave, but so much more. The word malignant can drive us into the cave. A tragic accident, an unfaithful spouse, the betrayal of a friend, the disappointment of a dream job gone bad, the cruelty of others. Death itself chases us into a cave-like grave. Few of us, some of us, many of us, most of us, no, all of us have or will spend time in the cave. The question is not, will you end up there? The question is, how will you respond when you find yourself there? And when you are a man or woman after God's own heart, the answer is you will cry out to God in prayer. Because that's all you can do. That's all that remains. And that's what David does. This is one aspect of his life that is worth imitating. In response to gut-wrenching disappointment, this is not the way his life was supposed to be. This is not what he thought Samuel was preparing him for. In response to life-threatening adversity, he is the most wanted man in Israel. David cries out to the Lord. He gives the Lord his pain, his disillusionment, his fear. And in doing so, he leaves a legacy that has encouraged cave dwellers now for thousands of years. Gene Edwards says in his book, A Tale of Two Kings, he said, there in those caves, drowned in the sorrow of his song, And in the song of his sorrow, David very simply became the greatest hymn writer and greatest comforter of broken hearts this world shall ever know. I don't know how long David spent in the cave. I don't know how many different caves David hid in. I don't know how many prayer songs David wrote while in the cave. But I know that two of the Psalms that we have in the Hebrew Scriptures, two of those Psalms are specifically attributed to this period of time in David's life. Psalm 142 is a cave prayer. There's a little label at the very beginning. You see it in your Bible. It says, this is a Psalm of David. When he was in the cave, this is a prayer. This is one of David's cave prayers. Imagine as we read this psalm, imagine first David uttering this in the darkness of a cave. He says in verse 1, I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell my trouble. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who watch over my way. In the path where I walk, David says, people have hidden a snare for me. Look and see. There is no one at my right hand. In other words, David said, there's no one here to help me. I'm all alone. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. This is the essence of cave prayer. He does not gloss over the pain. He does not minimize the threat. There's no pretend optimism here. He doesn't pretend things are better than they really are. No, he said, it's as bad as it can possibly be. No, David, it's worse than you realize. David says, there's no one helps, no one cares. I have no place to hide. I have no refuge. Maybe one of the reasons God allows people, circumstances, and events to chase us into the cave, because in the cave we realize we have no place else to go. No one else to turn to except for the Lord. Young David, while not perfect, has done nothing to deserve being made a target of Saul, except be really good at his job and remain faithful to God and the king, to remain loyal. That's it. And yet here he is in the cave. And in the cave, God uses this experience, this pain, this darkness, to draw David closer to God and to season him as a leader, which in the long run is going to help him be a better king. We keep reading this psalm in verse 5. David says, I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I am in desperate need. Rescue me from those who pursue me, for they are too strong for me. I love this line. Set me free from my prison. Cave is this prison. Set me free from this prison, that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. David begins the prayer talking about how bad it is, how dark it is. No one cares. No one's there. But then he finishes the prayer by saying, Lord, I trust you to save me. In the cave, David maybe learns that when he's in trouble, rather than resorting to deception or schemes to save himself, he can trust the Lord to be not only his refuge, but his salvation. Maybe it's in the cave that the Lord is teaching David the lessons he needs to learn so that other people don't continue to get caught in the wake of his deception. We know this is a lesson that David will learn imperfectly and over a long period of time. A little bit later, in 1 Samuel chapter 24, David is once again hiding in a cave. This time he's with his men. They've joined him in the wilderness. And they're hiding together in this cave because Saul and his army are nearby. And when Saul steps into the mouth of the cave to do the king's business, David's men say, hey, this is your opportunity. The Lord has delivered your enemy into your hands. Kill him. David says in chapter 24, verse 6, he said, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. David says, I'm not touching him. It's not for me to take down the Lord's anointed. And then a little later, David calls out to Saul and tells him, I could have killed you in the cave. You had fallen into my hands and you didn't even know it. And he says in verse 11 and 15, he says this to Saul. He says, I have not wronged you, but you were hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. David recognizes that the throne is not his to take from Saul. It is God's to give. And he resolves to trust the Lord and wait for it. And I can't help but wonder if maybe this perspective, this patience, this maturity we see in David is at least partly the result of all those long, hard, painful hours he has spent praying in the cave. God uses the cave to make David a better man. Psalm 57 is another one of David's cave prayers, and it starts in much the same way that Psalm 142 does. Have mercy on me, my God. Have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. I'm in trouble. I need help. I'm relying on you. That's how it starts. But then the psalm ends on a note of praise and thanksgiving. Verse 7, David says, my heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. Imagine he's praying this in a cave. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. For David, the cave at the beginning is a place to cry out for God, to ask for God's help and God's protection. But then David's experience of God in the cave changes the cave into a place of praise and worship. In the cave, David's cry turns into praise. Even while he's still in the cave, he believes, he's trusting, he knows that the cave is not the end of his story. The cave is not the end of his story. David's descendant, Jesus, will also end up in a cave of sorts. And it's not the end of his story. And the cave is not the end of our story. Just as God brought David and Jesus out of their respective caves and into something bigger and better and more glorious, God will do the same for us. If you today are in a cave, don't give up. And don't be quiet. Cry out to the Lord. Trust and wait. And look for God's light to break into the darkness. No matter what has brought you there, no matter what has chased you there, no matter what is holding you and pinning you there in the cave, know that the cave is not the end of your story. May God continue to use the cave to remind us of what it means to say God is our refuge and to deepen our faith and our trust in God as our salvation. Let's stand and sing.